The observation deck of the celestial envoy was a blister of reinforced crystal and polarized alloy, offering a silent, sweeping vista of the star-dusted void. It was here that Preceptor Kalen, chief xenosociologist of the Hegemony's Grand Survey, stood with his upper set of arms clasped tightly behind his back, his lower pair resting on the console before him. His chitinous plates, a deep umber flecked with gold, reflected the soft, ambient lighting of the ship, but his primary eyes, large and multifaceted, were fixed on the world below. Designated P-387, or Terra, as its inhabitants called it, hung in the blackness like a flawed marble of stunning blue, swirled with vibrant white and stubborn patches of brown and green. It was a world of breathtaking, almost aggressive vitality, a stark contrast to the meticulously managed and often sterile biospheres of the Hegemony's core worlds. The initial broad-spectrum scans had been promising, then puzzling, and finally, deeply concerning. The planet was a treasure trove of biological diversity and moderate mineral wealth, but it was also a cauldron of extreme weather, tectonic volatility, and a biosphere where seemingly everything, from the smallest microbe to the largest fauna, was equipped with some form of toxin, venom, or defensive spike. Kalen's mandibles twitched in a subtle expression of unease as he reviewed the preliminary data streams on his console. The dominant species, self-designated as humanity, was a study in baffling contradictions. Their technological development was uneven, leaping from primitive combustion to rudimentary fission and fusion in a handful of their generations. Yet they had failed to achieve the fundamental societal unity the Hegemony considered a prerequisite for interstellar civilization. They were divided into hundreds of competing political and cultural factions, engaged in constant, low-level conflict. Their history was a relentless chronicle of war, pestilence, and self-inflicted calamity, and yet they had not only survived, they had, in their own chaotic and inefficient way, thrived. Their population was vast, their cities sprawling, chaotic hubs of activity that defied hegemony urban planning principles. They were, by all measurable standards, a pre-contact species teetering on the brink of either self-destruction or a breakthrough into the galactic community. The Hegemony's mandate was clear: observe, assess, and if the species was deemed sufficiently unified and advanced, initiate first contact. If not, they were to be quarantined, their world marked for potential future review in another few centuries or millennia. The data remains inconclusive. Preceptor, a smooth, synthesized voice stated from beside him. The speaker was Unit 734, a diplomatic automaton whose polished chrome form was designed to be as inoffensive and logical as possible. Their global political structure is non-existent. They lack a centralized governing body, a unified legal framework, or even a common primary language. Their capacity for coordinated action on a planetary scale appears limited to responses to existential threats, and even those responses are often fractured and contentious. Probability models suggest a high likelihood of societal collapse within the next 5 of their generations due to resource depletion and environmental degradation. The quarantine protocol seems the most logical course of action. Kalen shifted his weight, his lower limbs making a soft clicking sound against the deck plating. Logic would certainly dictate that unit, and yet there are anomalies. He gestured with a slender, three-fingered hand towards the planet. Observe their orbital infrastructure. It is a mess, a junkyard of derelict satellites, active stations of varying ages and technological levels, and the debris of their own conflicts. But it is extensive. They have achieved a permanent presence in their local space, despite their divisions. Furthermore, their information networks, while chaotic and flooded with misinformation, are global in scope. They argue, they fight, they disseminate absurdities, but they are all connected. It is a unity of a different kind, a unity of constant, noisy interaction. Interaction that is predominantly hostile or frivolous, Unit 734 countered, its photoreceptor glowing a steady, neutral blue. It does not meet the hegemony standard for societal cohesion. A single, unified voice is required for stable integration. These humans have thousands of voices, all shouting at once. Perhaps, Kalen murmured, his attention caught by a new data packet. It was a cultural digest compiled by the ship's linguistic AIs. It contained snippets of human fiction, historical records, and philosophical texts. He had been poring over them in his off-cycle, trying to find the key to understanding this bizarre species. They wrote epic tales of heroes facing impossible odds, not with superior technology or logic, but with sheer, stubborn will. They celebrated figures who stood alone against armies, who defied gods and monsters with little more than courage and a sharpened piece of metal. They had a concept they called the human spirit, an indefinable quality of resilience that their own histories suggested was their primary survival trait. It was illogical, it was unscientific, and Kalen found it utterly fascinating. His musings were interrupted by a priority alert from the bridge. Preceptor Kalen to the command center, we have a situation. The voice of the ship's commander, a veteran navigator named Vorlak, was tense. Kalen exchanged a glance with Unit 734, a meaningless gesture for the automaton, but a necessary one for his own species, need for non-verbal communication, and moved swiftly from the observation deck. The command center of the Celestial Envoy was a hive of quiet, controlled activity. Hegemony crew members, their insectoid forms moving with precise efficiency, monitored countless readouts and holographic displays. At the center stood Navigator Vorlak, his larger, more heavily armored frame denoting his military background. His primary eyes were fixed on the main tactical display, which showed a schematic of the Terran solar system. A new unidentified contact had just transitioned at the system's edge, moving under power at high velocity. It was not a hegemony vessel. Analysis? Kalen asked, coming to stand beside Vorlak. The signature is not in our databases, Vorlak stated, his voice a low rumble. The configuration is aggressive. High energy output focused on propulsion and what appear to be weapons systems. They are on a direct course for the third planet. He turned his head slightly towards Kalen. They have not responded to our standard hails on any frequency. They are broadcasting a wide-spectrum jamming signal. This is not a survey mission. A cold dread settled in Kalen's thorax. A first contact scenario with an unassessed, potentially hostile species was a xenosociologist's nightmare. And humanity was completely unprepared. They had no unified planetary defense, no fleet capable of challenging a vessel of that size and power. Their world would be overrun, their people enslaved or exterminated before they even understood what was happening. The hegemony's prime directive, the cornerstone of its expansion policy, was strict non-interference with pre-contact species. To reveal themselves, to intervene, would be a violation of the highest order. It would throw centuries of careful policy into chaos. They will be annihilated, Unit 734 stated, its synthetic voice devoid of emotion. The human species does not possess the coordinated military capacity to resist an invasion of this scale. The logical course of action is to maintain our observational posture, record the event for future study, and withdraw once the hostile force has established control. The hegemony can then open diplomatic channels with the new governing entity. Kalen looked from the unblinking photoreceptor of the automaton to the grim face of Navigator Vorlak. On the main display, the alien ship, a jagged, angular thing of dark metal, continued its inexorable advance towards the vibrant blue world. He thought of the data streams, of the thousands of shouting voices, of the stories of stubborn heroes, and the concept of an unyielding spirit. He thought of a world that had forged its life in fire and ice, where survival was a daily battle. The logic was undeniable, the protocol was clear, but something within him, something that went beyond his training as a preceptor, rebelled. Navigator, Kalen said, his voice quieter than he intended. What is the estimated time until the hostile vessel enters high orbit? At their current velocity, approximately 14 of their planetary cycles, Vorlak replied. They are not rushing. They are confident. 14 days. 14 days for a fractured world to prepare for an enemy it did not know was coming. It was an impossible task. And yet, we cannot interfere, Preceptor, Vorlak said, as if reading his thoughts. The prime directive is absolute. Our mission is to observe, not to act. To observe their extinction, Kalen asked, his mandibles tight. Is that the purpose of the Grand Survey? To simply catalogue the ruins of failed civilizations? It is the law, Unit 734 interjected. Emotional response is not a valid parameter for decision-making. The collapse of the human political and social structure is a foregone conclusion. Intervention would be illogical and a violation of our core principles. Kalen turned back to the display, watching the blip of the hostile ship. He thought of the human concept of a forlorn hope, a desperate mission with little chance of success, undertaken not because it was logical, but because it was right. It was a sentiment his own deeply logical, hive-adjacent culture could never truly comprehend. But standing here, on the precipice of a galactic tragedy, he felt he was beginning to understand it. The law was clear, but sometimes, he suspected, the universe did not care for laws. Sometimes it only respected strength. And as he watched the vulnerable world below, he wondered what kind of strength humanity truly possessed. The decision, when it came, was not born from a sudden, heroic clarity, but from a slow, grinding tension that built within the very corridors of the celestial envoy. For 3 full Terran diurnal cycles, the debate raged between the command staff, the scientific core led by Kalen, and the unwavering logic of the diplomatic automata. Navigator Vorlak held firm to the prime directive, his military discipline a wall against the rising tide of unease. Unit 734 and its counterparts presented endless probability matrices, all of which pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity was a lost cause, and intervention was an unacceptable risk, with no tangible reward. Kalen, however, had not been idle. While the official channels were locked in stalemate, he had directed his team to delve deeper. They bypassed the high-level political and economic data and focused on the granular, on the patterns of human behavior in times of extreme stress. They analyzed disaster response footage from 100 different regions, the frantic, collaborative efforts in the aftermath of earthquakes and tsunamis, the spontaneous order that emerged from the chaos of a blackout in one of their megacities, the way neighborhoods banded together when official aid was slow to arrive. They studied their military history, not the grand strategies, but the accounts of individual soldiers in hopeless battles, of civilians resisting occupation with homemade weapons and sheer grit. They are not a hive, Navigator, Kalen argued during the 4th strategy session, his data streams projecting onto the central holotank. They do not have a single, overriding purpose. But they have something else. Look at this. The display showed a historical recording from one of their many global conflicts. A city was in rubble, its defenders outnumbered and outgunned. Yet, from every broken window, from every pile of debris, came gunfire. There was no centralized command, no coordinated battle plan. It was 1,000 individual decisions to resist. They call it asymmetric warfare. The weak finding ways to harry and bleed the strong. They are masters of it. Their entire history is a textbook on how a technologically inferior force can make victory so costly for a superior one that it becomes a defeat in all but name. These are anecdotes, Preceptor, Unit 734 stated, a collection of historical outliers. The statistical probability of a unified planetary defense forming in the 14 cycles we have remaining is less than 0.001%. Their governments are already in a state of denial and panic, according to our intercepted communications. They are attributing the incoming vessel to each other, to solar flares, to mass hallucinations. But they are looking, Kalen insisted. Their planet-wide astronomical networks have detected the anomaly. Their militaries are on heightened alert, even if they don't know why. The seed of awareness is there. What they lack is a target. What they lack is time. Vorlak's armored plates shifted with a sound like grinding stone. What are you proposing, Preceptor? That we break silence? That we give them a target? That would be more than intervention. It would be an act of war against the unidentified vessel. We would be choosing a side. We would be choosing to not stand by while a sentient species is erased, Kalen replied, his voice firm. The Prime Directive was designed to protect developing cultures from our influence. It was not designed to be a suicide pact or a mandate for passive observation of genocide. There is a higher principle at stake here, the principle of life. The chamber fell silent. The argument had been made and rebuffed a dozen times before, but Kalen could see a subtle shift in Vorlak's posture. The navigator was a soldier, and to a soldier, the concept of a hopeless last stand carried a certain grim respect, even if it was illogical. It was a new data point that finally broke the deadlock. A long-range sensor sweep of the unidentified vessel revealed something the initial scans had missed. In its wake, the ship left a faint but detectable residue of certain heavy elements and radioactive isotopes. The signature was unique, but it matched historical records from the Hegemony's early expansionist era. It was the signature of a species the Hegemony had encountered and fought centuries ago. The Cathar, a rapacious, nomadic race that consumed worlds, stripping them of all usable resources and moving on, leaving behind dead husks. They were a civilization with no concept of art, of philosophy, of anything beyond acquisition and consumption. They were, in the Hegemony's classification, a galactic-level pestilence, believed to have been pushed back into the unexplored fringes of the galaxy. The Cathar, Vorlak breathed, the name a curse. If it is them, then this is not merely an invasion. It is an extermination. They will not stop until the biosphere is broken and every ounce of metal is scooped from the planet's crust. Unit 734 processed the new data. Its photoreceptor flickered from blue to a hesitant yellow. This changes the strategic calculation. A Cathar infestation in this sector poses a potential long-term threat to Hegemony interests. Allowing them to consume a world with such vast biological and mineral resources would increase their threat level significantly. It was the cold, pragmatic reasoning Kalen needed. The moral argument had failed, but the argument of strategic necessity found purchase. Vorlak straightened, his decision made. The Prime Directive does not account for the presence of a recognized existential threat to galactic stability. We are authorized to take limited action in such a scenario. Unit 734, prepare a first contact package. A compressed data burst containing everything we know about the Cathar, their capabilities, their tactics, their weaknesses. Preceptor Kalen, you will compose the message. Make it clear to the humans what they are facing, but we will not reveal ourselves. We will transmit the data and withdraw to a higher orbit to observe. What they do with the warning is up to them. It was a compromise, a thin thread of hope tossed into the storm of human chaos. Kalen returned to his quarters and stared at the blank composition screen. How did one tell an entire world that everything they knew was about to end? How did one explain the concept of a galaxy teeming with life, much of it hostile, to a species that still looked to the stars with wonder and hope? He thought of the human stories, of the warnings shouted from the ramparts. He would have to be that voice. He worked for hours, condensing millennia of xenological data into a coherent, terrifying narrative. He included schematics of Cathar warrior forms, their energy weapon profiles, their preference for orbital bombardment to soften targets, their reliance on swarming, close-quarters tactics. He explained that the Cathar had no concept of diplomacy, of surrender, of quarter. They were a force of nature, a biological engine of destruction. He ended the message not with a plea, but with a stark, simple statement of fact, a line he had found in a human military text. The enemy is at the gate. They offer only death. Your only choices are to submit and be erased, or to fight. The transmission was sent not to any one government, but broadcast across every frequency, encrypted with a simple mathematical key that any of their major powers could break. It was a data packet of pure, unvarnished truth, a bomb of knowledge dropped into the heart of human civilization. From the celestial envoy, hanging silently in the void, they watched as the signal propagated, washing over the planet in an invisible wave. The first signs of reception were localized confusion. Then, as the data was decrypted and understood, the chaos began. They saw the frantic scrambling of military forces, the emergency sessions of their fractured governments, the panic and the fear spreading through their information networks. It was a world seizing up in terror. For a long, dreadful hour, Kalen feared that Unit 734 had been right, that the shock would paralyze them. And then, something remarkable happened. It did not start from the top. It did not come from a president or a prime minister or a general. It started from the bottom. In 100 different cities, people began gathering in public squares. In 1,000 different online forums, the conversations shifted from panic to planning. Engineers and scientists, bypassing their governments, began collaborating on open channels, analyzing the Cathar technical data, looking for weaknesses. Veterans began organizing local defense militias. Factory workers, without being ordered, began retooling assembly lines. The thousands of shouting voices did not unite into a single, harmonious choir. They became a cacophonous, chaotic, but desperately focused symphony. They were not one people, but they were, in that moment, one will, the will to resist. Kalen watched the global network traffic light up with a new, dominant keyword, a phrase that was translated from hundreds of languages but carried the same defiant meaning. It was not a call for help. It was not a prayer to their gods. It was a simple, brutal acknowledgement of their new reality, a phrase that would become their rallying cry in the days to come. The harvesters are here. A tense silence had fallen over the celestial envoy. The die was cast, the warning given. Now there was nothing to do but watch. The ship had withdrawn to a higher, stationary orbit behind the planet's single, pockmarked moon, a vantage point that allowed for continued observation while minimizing the risk of detection by the approaching Cathar vessel. The main viewer was split into multiple feeds, one tracking the relentless advance of the harvester ship, now close enough for visual confirmation of its jagged, predatory shape, another showing a synthesized overview of Terran global data traffic, and a third displaying real-time imagery from the planet's surface. Preceptor Kalen stood beside Navigator Vorlak, his multifaceted eyes taking in the chaotic, beautiful, and terrifying tapestry of human response. The initial, global paralysis had lasted less than a single diurnal cycle. What followed was an explosion of activity so frenetic and disorganized that it defied all hegemony models of societal function. They are not building a unified defense grid, Unit 734 observed, its photoreceptor pulsing with the fluctuating data streams. They are engaging in thousands of localized, uncoordinated projects. This is grossly inefficient. Probability of success remains critically low. Look closer, Unit, Kalen said, his voice tinged with a fascination that overrode his fear. He zoomed in on one of the surface feeds. It showed a sprawling, arid region on one of the larger continents. The local human government had issued orders to fortify the population centers, but the people in the scattered, rural settlements had ignored this. Instead of fleeing to the cities, they were digging. Using industrial mining equipment, agricultural machinery, and sheer muscle, they were turning the very soil into a fortress. They were creating vast, labyrinthine tunnel networks, camouflaged firing positions, and underground storehouses. They were not preparing for a stand-up fight. They were preparing to bleed the enemy, to make every kilometer of ground a costly nightmare. This is what they call guerrilla warfare, Kalen explained. They are conceding the open ground. They are inviting the harvesters in and planning to attack them from the shadows, from below, from everywhere at once. It is a strategy born from a long history of dealing with stronger invaders. On another feed, from a densely populated island nation, they saw a different approach. The government had mobilized with stunning speed, but not just the military. Every citizen seemed to have a role. Civil engineers were reinforcing seawalls and designing anti-orbital sabotage plans for their undersea infrastructure. School teachers were organizing evacuation drills for children. Chefs from competing restaurants had pooled their resources to create massive communal kitchens to feed the workers. There was no single commander, but a cultural instinct for collective action that had kicked in, a societal immune system responding to a pathogen. Then there were the spacefaring nations. Their orbital assets, once a disorganized clutter, were being repurposed with a desperate, reckless ingenuity. Communication satellites were being jury-rigged with propulsion units and simple kinetic impactors. Derelict space stations were being converted into makeshift missile platforms or sacrificial debris fields. They watched as a crew of astronauts, working outside their aging space station, manually welded sharpened girders to its hull, turning it into a primitive, orbiting porcupine. It was a futile gesture against the advanced armor of a Cathar warship, but it was a gesture. It was defiance. They are using their chaos as a weapon, Vorlak rumbled, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. The Cathar are a logical enemy. They will expect a logical defense, fortified positions, fleet engagements, centralized command and control. The humans are offering them none of that. They are offering a quagmire. The Cathar ship, now designated Reaper by the panicked but organizing human networks, did not deviate from its course. It entered high orbit with a silent, menacing finality. There was no hailing frequency, no demand for surrender. The harvesters did not communicate. They simply acted. From bays on its underside, dozens of smaller, dagger-shaped drop ships detached and began their descent through the atmosphere. Simultaneously, larger, bulbous vessels began deploying what the Hegemony databases identified as ground assault forms, hulking, six-limbed biomechanical constructs, and swarms of smaller, skittering hunter-killer drones. The first strikes were precisely what the Hegemony's historical records predicted. Kinetic rods and focused energy beams lanced down from the Reaper, targeting military bases, power grids, communication hubs, and industrial centers. Brilliant flowers of fire and light bloomed across the night side of the planet. The humans' satellite network was shredded in the first volley, and their global communications began to flicker and die. From a tactical perspective, it was a masterstroke. The head of the beast was being severed, but the beast had no single head. The human response was not a coordinated counterpunch, but a global convulsion. As the Cathar dropships touched down in what they had logically selected as key strategic locations, near capital cities, major ports, resource depots, they were not met with orderly lines of defense. They were met with chaos. In one city, the invading force was funneled into wide boulevards, only to be hit from every rooftop and window with a hailstorm of projectile fire, Molotov cocktails, and even hurled bricks. The initial Cathar advance, designed to overwhelm a conventional military, stalled in the face of 1,000 individual snipers and 1,000,000 angry civilians. In another region, a column of the hulking ground assault forms was moving through a mountain pass when the mountains themselves seemed to come alive. Pre-placed demolition charges, triggered by farmers watching from hidden perches, brought down avalanches of rock and earth, burying the entire column. There was no army to fight, only the landscape itself turned hostile. Kalen watched, mesmerized, as a feed from a dying military drone showed a harvester drop ship setting down in the center of a vast, flat agricultural plain. It was a logical landing zone, offering clear fields of fire. But as its ramps lowered and the warriors began to deploy, the very ground beneath them erupted. Dozens of humans, clad in the rough clothing of farmers, emerged from hidden tunnels, firing outdated rifles and shotguns at point-blank range before disappearing back into the earth. They were picked off eventually by the superior firepower of the drones, but not before they had inflicted casualties and, more importantly, sown confusion and fear. The harvesters were prepared for war. They were not prepared for this pestilence. Their centralized command structure has been effectively destroyed, Unit 734 reported. Yet, resistance efficacy has only decreased by 18% from pre-invasion projections. This is an anomaly. Localized command nodes are emerging, often with no official authority. They are coordinating via hardwired landlines, short-range radio, and even runners. They are an ecosystem, Kalen said softly. You can burn down a forest, but the roots remain, and from the roots, new growth emerges. They are fighting like their planet fights, with bacteria, with viruses, with thorns and poisons, and sheer, overwhelming resilience. The view screens were a patchwork of victory and horror. Great cities burned, their skylines etched in flame. But from the ashes of those cities, small, stubborn pockets of resistance continued to flash, like embers that refused to die. The harvesters controlled the orbital space. They controlled the skies. They controlled, by any logical definition, the planet. And yet the planet was consuming them. The unyielding soil, Kalen thought, remembering the title he had given his private log. The soil that looked soft and welcoming, but that would grip an invader's feet and never let go until it had swallowed them whole. A standard Terran week after the first projectiles had scarred the atmosphere, the nature of the conflict shifted. The initial furious, global spasm of resistance had bled the Cathar advance, slowing it to a bloody crawl in every theater. The harvesters, however, were not a stupid species. They were ruthlessly adaptive. Their logic circuits, both biological and mechanical, processed the unexpected resistance and began to formulate a new, more terrible strategy. From the Celestial Envoy's vantage point, the change was immediately apparent. The Reaper, which had been methodically targeting large-scale infrastructure, now began to deploy a new type of payload. These were not kinetic impactors, but canisters that broke apart in the upper atmosphere, releasing a fine, metallic chaff. It was a counterinsurgency measure, designed to permanently blanket the planet and disrupt the remaining, fragile web of human communication. At the same time, the ground assault forms changed their tactics. They ceased their head-on assaults on population centers and began a systematic, grid-by-grid cleansing. They used seismic sensors to hunt for tunnels and chemical sniffers to root out human scent. They were no longer trying to conquer the planet. They were trying to sterilize it. They are transitioning to a scorched earth protocol, Vorlak stated grimly. They have recognized that they cannot pacify the human population, so they will eliminate it. They will methodically hunt down every last pocket of resistance, no matter how small. This will take time, but their logic is inescapable. Without the ability to coordinate on a large scale, the human resistance will be whittled down, isolated, and destroyed. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten within him. Vorlak was right. The human strategy of decentralized, local resistance was brilliant against an invasion force seeking a quick victory, but against a patient, systematic extermination, it was a death sentence. 1,000 isolated pockets of defiance could not stand against an enemy that was willing to spend years digging them out, one by one. The reports coming in from the fractured planetary network were increasingly desperate. A resistance cell in a northern continent, having held out for days in a hydroelectric dam, had finally been silenced when the Cathar simply diverted the river and flooded the lower levels. A group of survivors in a subterranean transit system had been found and eliminated using thermal imaging. The noose was tightening. It was then that a new signal emerged. It was weak, broadcast on an archaic frequency, and heavily encrypted with a cipher that the Hegemony's AIs took several minutes to break. It was not a plea for help or a report of a lost battle. It was a blueprint, a schematic for a weapon. Kalen and his team analyzed the data. It was a design for a high-powered, directional electromagnetic pulse device. It was crude, inefficient, and would require a massive power source, but its principle was sound. In a single, concentrated burst, it could theoretically disable the electronic systems of every Cathar unit within a several-kilometer radius. It would not destroy them, but it would render them inert, blind, and deaf for a critical window of time. The humans had named the project Gorgon. "This is audacious," Kalen murmured, studying the complex diagrams. "But the power requirements are immense. They would need to tap a primary electrical grid, and most of those are down or under harvester control." "The transmission source is triangulated," a junior analyst reported. "It is originating from a deep underground facility formerly used for geological research. Designation: the Vault. It is located beneath a mountain range on the primary continent. Scans indicate it has its own geothermal power plant, which is likely why it has remained operational. They are planning to use the facility as both a power source and a broadcast tower," Vorlak deduced. "They will turn the entire mountain into a weapon, but the Cathar will detect the power surge. They will throw everything they have at that location long before the device can be charged." "Which is why it is a trap," Kalen said, a spark of understanding igniting in his mind. He called up the broader tactical situation around the mountain range. The area was designated as a secondary target by the Cathar, but it was now swarming with their forces, drawn by the persistent radio traffic from the vault. The humans were not hiding. They were broadcasting their presence, a defiant beacon in the darkness. They were daring the harvesters to come. Over the next 48 hours, the Celestial Env became silent witnesses to a battle that would be etched into the memory of every surviving human. The Gorgon device was not a secret weapon to be used for a surprise victory. It was a gambit, a single, desperate throw of the dice to change the fundamental calculus of the war. The Cathar took the bait. The Reaper in orbit shifted its focus, directing the bulk of its ground forces towards the mountain range. Dropships fell from the sky like metallic rain, disgorging thousands of warrior forms and drones. The humans did not meet them on the open ground. They fought from fortified ridges, from hidden caves, from camouflaged bunkers. They fought with rifles, with explosives, with knives, and with rocks. They fought for every inch of the mountain, knowing that their only purpose was to buy time for the engineers in the vault to complete their work. The feeds from the surface were fragmented and often went dark as transmitters were destroyed. But the story they told was one of unimaginable sacrifice. A small group of defenders held a narrow pass against wave after wave of assault forms until they were literally overrun. A team of technicians, their entrance sealed by rockfall, manually rerouted power conduits through a radioactive section of the facility, knowing it was a suicide mission. The battle was a microcosm of the entire war, technologically superior force against unyielding, defiant will. Kalen watched, his own body rigid with tension. He saw humans throw themselves onto Cathar energy weapons to give their comrades a few more seconds to fall back. He saw a wounded soldier, using his last breath to detonate a cluster of grenades that collapsed a tunnel on a squad of hunters. This was not the calculated, strategic warfare of the Hegemony. This was something raw, primal, and terrifyingly beautiful. It was the human spirit, stripped of all pretense, screaming its defiance into the face of annihilation. Inside the vault, the power levels for the Gorgon device climbed, a slow, agonizing crawl towards the critical threshold. The Cathar, sensing the imminent threat, redoubled their efforts. They began tunneling. They used focused plasma cutters to breach the reinforced doors. They dropped seismic charges to collapse the deeper chambers. Finally, a breach was made. Cathar hunter-killers poured into the main control room of the vault. The last transmission from inside was a video feed. It showed a handful of engineers, armed only with tools, making their final stand in front of the central console. The lead engineer, a woman with singed hair and a bloodied face, looked directly into the camera. She didn't scream a curse or a prayer. She simply smiled, a grim, tired smile of absolute victory, and slammed her hand down on a large, red button. The screen filled with static. A moment later, the long-range sensors of the celestial envoy registered a massive, localized M-burst emanating from the mountain. It expanded outwards in a perfect, invisible sphere. On the surface, every HA unit within a 50-kilometer radius simply stopped. Their internal lights winked out, their limbs locked. They stood like metallic statues, frozen in mid-action. The relentless advance halted. The victory was local, it was temporary. The Reaper in orbit was untouched, and it would simply manufacture more troops. The cost had been catastrophic. The entire defense force around the vault had been wiped out. But as the news of what had happened spread through the surviving human resistance networks, via courier, via salvaged radios, via whispers in the dark, it ignited a fire. The harvesters were not invincible. They could be hurt. They could be stopped. The Gorgon strike, as it came to be known, did not win the war, but it gave humanity something far more important than a tactical victory. It gave them hope. And for a species like humanity, Kalen realized, hope was a weapon more powerful than any starship. The aftermath of the Gorgon strike settled over the wounded world like a layer of radioactive dust, lethal, silent, and enduring. The celestial envoy's sensors painted a grim picture. The Cathar Reaper, strung by the temporary setback, had intensified its scorched earth campaign. Vast areas of the planet were now designated silent zones, where all biological and technological signatures had been systematically erased. The human population, which had numbered in the billions, was now a scattered collection of survivors, hiding in ruins, deep wilderness, and subterranean refuges. Global communication was a phantom, a ghost in the machine that occasionally flickered to life with a desperate, isolated message before being snuffed out. On the bridge of the envoy, the mood was somber. The brilliant, defiant flame of human resistance had been dampened, reduced to a collection of stubborn embers. Navigator Vorlak reviewed the tactical data with a heavy heart. The Gorgon device was a remarkable achievement, but it was a one-time gambit. The Cathar have adapted. They are now deploying hardened systems resistant to M attack. They are also increasing the production of their biomechanical units. The humans are being hunted to extinction. It is only a matter of time. Unit 734, its logic seemingly confirmed, stated, "The outcome is now inevitable." The resource expenditure required for the humans to mount another large-scale operation is beyond their remaining capacity. Recommendation: we conclude our observation and withdraw. The data collected on human resistance tactics and Cathar adaptation will be of significant value to the Hegemony military. Preceptor Kalen did not respond immediately. He was consumed by the data from a different stream. While the macroscopic view was one of unrelenting defeat, the microscopic view told a different story. He had tasked his team with focusing on the silent zones, not with broad-spectrum scans, but with hypersensitive listening posts designed to detect the faintest whispers of activity, and they were finding them. In a silent zone that had once been a major coastal city, now a graveyard of shattered concrete and twisted steel, they detected rhythmic, subsonic vibrations. It was the sound of machinery operating deep beneath the ruins. Analysis suggested it was a water filtration and recycling plant, jury-rigged and running on geothermal vents. Someone was down there, not just hiding, but living, surviving. In another zone, a vast forest that had been seared by plasma fire, their bioscanners detected movement. Not the large, warm-blooded signatures of human life, but the subtle, cool traces of humans using advanced thermal dampening blankets and moving only at night. They were foraging, setting traps, communicating with light signals. They were learning to become ghosts in their own world. "They are not dying out," Kalen said, his voice quiet but firm. "They are going to ground. They are becoming part of the planet's background radiation. The Cathar are looking for an army to fight. They are finding only a memory." "A memory cannot win a war," Vorlak countered. "Can it not?" Kalen turned to face the navigator. "What is a species but a collective memory, a shared story? The harvesters are destroying their bodies, but they are failing to destroy their story. Look at this." He brought up a new file on the main viewer. It was a compilation of data fragments salvaged from dying networks. It was not military data. It was cultural data. It was music files, text documents, works of art, historical archives. And it was being copied over and over again onto hardened data drives. It was being hidden in sealed containers and buried. It was being transmitted in compressed, burst mode packets on random frequencies, a message in a bottle tossed into an ocean of static. "They are preserving their identity," Kalen explained. "They are ensuring that even if they are all killed, their story, what it meant to be human, will not be erased. They are fighting for their place in history. It is the most profound form of resistance I have ever witnessed." This cultural stubbornness began to manifest in more active forms of warfare. The resistance was no longer about holding territory. It was about legacy. A cell of survivors, hiding in the sub-basements of a ruined university, used salvaged equipment to hack into a low-power Cathar communications relay. They did not transmit a call to arms. They broadcast a reading of ancient poetry, verses about endurance and the beauty of a sunrise, for 3 full minutes before the signal was traced and obliterated. In a desert region, a lone survivor, whom the Envy's sensors identified as a former engineer, spent weeks meticulously building a series of large stone cairns in a specific mathematical pattern. From orbit, it was a meaningless arrangement of rocks. But from the perspective of the celestial Envy's high-resolution cameras, the pattern was unmistakable. It was a perfect representation of a DNA double helix. It was a message carved into the planet itself. We were here. This is what we were. These acts were, from a tactical standpoint, meaningless. They did not destroy a single harvester drone, but they had a psychological impact that the Hegemony's sensors could barely quantify. The Cathar, creatures of pure, cold logic, had no framework for understanding this behavior. Why expend precious energy on art when you are being hunted? Why risk exposure to broadcast music? It was irrational. It was a variable their predictive models could not account for. This irrationality began to corrode the Cathar's operational efficiency. Patrols became more cautious, more paranoid. They started firing at shadows, at strange rock formations, at the wind. The humans were no longer just a physical enemy. They had become a psychological one, a phantom that haunted the very minds of their hunters. The cost of the occupation, in terms of time and resources, was skyrocketing, while the return, a dead world, remained the same. Then the breakthrough came. It was not from a soldier or an engineer, but from a group of survivors hiding in a decommissioned orbital defense platform that had been drifting, powerless, since the first hours of the invasion. They had managed to restore minimal power, not to weapons, but to the station's powerful long-range sensor array, and they had been watching the Reaper. For weeks, they had collected data on its energy signatures, its communication patterns, its rotational cycles. They had found a flaw, a tiny, almost insignificant vulnerability in its layered shield system. During a specific maintenance cycle, when the ship was venting plasma from its primary drive, a harmonic frequency was created that caused a localized, milliseconds-long drop in the shielding over one of its main weapon emplacements. This data, this single, fragile piece of hope, was not broadcast. It was entrusted to a single, small, stealth-capable shuttle that had been hidden aboard the station. The shuttle, piloted by a volunteer who knew the odds were zero, made a desperate run for the planet's surface, dodging Cathar patrols, its sole mission to deliver this information to the largest remaining resistance cell they could find. The celestial envoy tracked the shuttle's frantic, evasive flight. They watched as it was hit, as it trailed atmosphere and fuel, as it crash-landed in a frozen northern wilderness. They watched the pilot's life signs flicker and fade, but before he died, he had ejected the data core. "They have a target," Vorlak said, his voice hushed with a kind of reverence. "They have found a chink in the dragon's armor, but they have no spear," Unit 734 stated the obvious. "They possess no spacecraft, no missiles capable of reaching orbit, no weapon that could exploit such a brief, precise window." Kalen looked from the frozen image of the crashed shuttle to the looming image of the Reaper, and then down at the wounded world below. The embers were still glowing. They were isolated, they were battered, and they were dying, but they had not gone out. And now they had a target. "They don't need a fleet," Kalen said, a strange certainty settling over him. "They just need one shot, and I believe they will find a way to take it. They have to. It is the final verse of their story." The final act of the human drama began not with a bang, but with a silent, desperate convergence. The data core from the dead pilot in the frozen north was recovered by a nomadic band of survivors. They, in turn, carried it for hundreds of kilometers on foot, through harvester-patrolled lands, to a known rendezvous point. From there, it was passed along a fragile, rediscovered network of runners and radio operators, a nervous system stirring back to life across the corpse of a planet. The message was simple, and it spread like a virus. "The Reaper can be hurt. We need one weapon, one chance." The celestial env, its sensors focused to an unprecedented degree, watched this quiet migration. They were not seeing armies massing. They were seeing individuals and small groups, moving under the cover of darkness and the ruined landscape. A team of engineers emerged from a hidden bunker beneath a collapsed dam, carrying schematics and rare earth magnets. A squad of soldiers, their uniforms in tatters, escorted a convoy of trucks salvaged from a scrapyard, their beds covered with tarps. A group of astrophysicists, who had been surviving by farming fungi in a subway tunnel, began performing complex calculations on salvaged chalkboards. They were all heading towards the same place, the Spire. It was the ruins of a massive, pre-invasion particle physics research facility, its main structure a towering accelerator ring that now lay partially collapsed and scorched. It had been written off by the Cathar as a target of no tactical value, its purpose incomprehensible to their utilitarian mindset. But to the humans, it was a cathedral of science, and it held the pieces of their last prayer. "They are attempting to reactivate the particle accelerator," Kalen's chief science officer reported, his voice laced with disbelief, "but not for its intended purpose. They are rewiring it. They are turning the entire ring into a massive, single-shot coil gun. They are going to use it to launch a projectile at the Reaper." The scale of the ambition was staggering. The engineering challenges were insurmountable by any rational standard. They lacked the materials, the power, the precision tools. The Cathar controlled the skies and would detect the massive energy signature the moment they tried to power the ring. It was a plan born not of logic, but of myth. It was a David and Goliath story written on a planetary scale. "It is impossible," Unit 734 stated flatly. "The probability of successfully constructing such a device with their available resources is zero. The probability of it surviving a Cathar counterstrike long enough to fire is zero. The probability of a single, unguided projectile hitting a specific, milliseconds-long vulnerability on a ship in high orbit is, for all practical purposes, zero." "Then why are they trying?" Vorlak asked, his gaze fixed on the feeds showing the hundreds of humans now swarming over the broken spire, working with the frantic energy of people who had nothing left to lose. "Because the alternative is zero," Kalen answered softly. "They are choosing the kind of zero they become." The construction of the weapon, dubbed the last argument by the humans, was a saga in itself. The Envi's records would later show it as a masterpiece of improvised engineering. Car engines were repurposed to generate power. The main projectile was forged from the melted-down hulls of tanks and the bronze from plundered statues, a fusion of war and memory. The targeting data was programmed into a salvaged military guidance computer, its housing cracked and held together with tape. It was the entirety of human ingenuity, resilience, and defiance, distilled into one rickety, beautiful, and terrifying machine. The Cathar inevitably detected the activity. The Reaper shifted its posture in orbit. Drop ships were dispatched. Ground forces began to converge on the spire from all directions. The final battle was not for a city or a resource, but for a symbol. What followed was a scene that would be etched into Kalen's memory forever. The humans did not form a defensive perimeter. They did the opposite. From every corner of the continent, the last vestiges of the resistance launched their own suicidal attacks. A ragged fleet of fishing boats and patrol craft emerged from hidden coves and charged a harvester coastal processing facility, drawing away its defensive fleet. In 1,000 different locations, hidden cells emerged from hiding and attacked any Cathar unit they could find, not to win, but to distract, to delay, to scream, "Look over here," with their lives. It was a planetary-scale sacrifice. They were giving their lives not for victory, but for a single chance, for one shot. At the spire, the workers labored on, even as harvester drop ships darkened the sky above them. They fought with wrenches and welding torches as the Cathar warriors breached the outer walls. The final moments were a chaos of close-quarters combat in the control room, of engineers throwing switches with one hand and firing a rifle with the other. On the bridge of the Celestial Envoy, there was absolute silence. Every screen was focused on the spire. The last argument was powering up, its jury-rigged capacitors whining with stored energy, overloading, threatening to tear themselves apart. The targeting solution was being fed into the guidance system, a frantic, manual upload as the Cathar blasted through the final door. Then it fired. There was no elegant, silent beam of light. The launch was a violent, concussive event that shattered the remaining structure of the spire and sent a shockwave rippling through the surrounding area. A single, tungsten-alloy slug, etched with the names of thousands of lost souls, was hurled into the sky. It was not fast by the standards of space warfare. It was a bullet, not a missile. It began its long, arcing journey towards the void. On the Reaper, the milliseconds-long shield fluctuation occurred, right on schedule. The Cathar logic saw the projectile. It calculated the trajectory. The probability of a hit was negligible. It was not worth the energy to shift course or activate point defense systems. It was an illogical act from an illogical species. The slug, tumbling end over end, entered the precise coordinates in space at the precise millisecond the shield flickered. It did not explode. It did not carry a warhead. It was simply a piece of a dead world, a piece of humanity itself. It struck the Reaper's primary weapon emplacement with the force of a small asteroid. The effect was not a fiery explosion. It was a rupture. A critical system failure that cascaded through the ship's network. The Reaper shuddered. A chain reaction began deep within its core as containment fields failed and plasma conduits ruptured. For a long, silent moment, it hung in orbit, a wounded leviathan. Then it broke apart, its dark form coming undone in a series of silent, internal flashes before being consumed by a final, star-bright detonation that momentarily outshone the system's sun. On the planet below, the sudden silence was more deafening than any explosion. The constant, oppressive hum of harvester drop ships was gone. The shadow of the Reaper was gone. In the command center of the Celestial Envoy, no one spoke. The crew, from the lowliest technician to Navigator Vorlak himself, stood in stunned silence. The main viewer showed the expanding debris field where the Reaper had been, and below, the quiet, wounded planet. Unit 734 was the first to break the silence. Its photoreceptor, which had glowed with cool blue logic for the entire mission, now flickered to a soft, steady green. It processed the terabytes of data from the final moments, The impossible shot, the sacrificial attacks, the sheer, unyielding will that had defied every probability model. The variable was not technological, it said, its synthesized voice softer, almost wondering. The variable was them. Kalen finally turned away from the viewer. He felt a profound exhaustion and a deeper, more profound respect. They had not won with superior technology or unified command. They had won by being human, by being stubborn, chaotic, beautiful, and unyielding to the very end. "The survey is complete, Navigator," Kalen said, his voice thick with emotion. "The human species has been assessed. They are not unified, they are not logical, they are not peaceful." He looked down at the world where the first faint signals of celebration were beginning to flicker across the scorched continents. "But they are, without question, worthy." Vorlak nodded slowly. "Then it is time. Unit 734, prepare the first contact protocols, the real one this time." He looked at Kalen, a new understanding in his old warrior's eyes. "It seems we have much to learn from the unyielding soil."